Thank you very much. It's in my office right now, so. I have to send you our coffee mug, which is, I don't know if you can see it, but it's an Adam Smith coffee mug. So that's me.
I have started YouTube live stream. So Anil, you can start.
Okay, I think now we are also leaving YouTube, dear professor. So let me firstly, I will introduce dear Professor Peter Boettke, and then I will give the floor to him, of course.
Yeah.
So, and also, of course, welcome to our departmental seminar of Yıldız Technical University of Department of Economics. Today, we are going to welcome dear Professor Peter Boettke from George Mason University. So, and as I said, let me introduce himself firstly. Dear Boettke received his master and PhD degree also in George Mason University, and he's mostly known as one of the most important economists in who is representing Austrian School of Economics. And he's also the director of the Frederick August Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at George Mason University. And also he is the editor of the Review of Austrian Economics and the society editor of the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. And he also, of course, he has many awards and honorary doctorates from different universities. There are many of them. So, for example, I think he has honorary doctorate from Universitat Francisco Moroccan from, I guess, Guatemala, and also another university in Romania, Alexandru Ioan Cuza University, where he has additional honorary doctorates. And also he has the author of many books, such as The Living Economics, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, The Economic Way of Thinking, and The Bundle of Ideas. Of course, these are only some of them. And also, I think his most recent book is about also Frederick August Hayek, as the title of Frederick August Hayek, Economics, Political Economy, and Social Philosophy, published in 2018. And of course, there are many other books, there are many publishings, and so on. But of course, I think the most important is ideas. And today we are here for listening, maybe my ideas in the title of Fate of Moral Philosophy in the Age of Economic Scientism. We are going to listen his presentation under this topic. And I think participants look forward to listen to you, dear professor. Therefore, I'm giving the floor to you. And after your conversation, we will take, of course, questions. If you're in a Zoom session, you can ask or you can write them down to the chat box in Zoom or YouTube, and then I will direct them. And now I'm giving the floor to you. So are you sharing any presentation?
I am.
Okay.
If I can do that, I can. Okay, good. There it is.
Yes. No, we can see perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, first of all, for that very kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to discuss this work. It's actually work that's working in working paper form, hasn't been publicly made available yet, but I gave it at one other conversation, so I'm hoping to get a lot of feedback on the questions and the maybe, you know, what points need to be emphasized, which ones don't. This is this paper is very much in line with the series that I had the opportunity to speak in earlier, that was organized by your colleague, and has to do with sort of economics more broadly conceived. So this paper is not particularly about Austrian economics and per se, but it's about sort of a broader implication of the way we think about our project as economists. And so hopefully, that will come out. But let me walk through the sort of basic argument. I'm going to try to argue that in this paper, I try to argue that our differences in economics ultimately turn on the question of who do we think we are modeling in economics, and the issue of the nature of the way we view human beings. So the battle for humanity in the social sciences, we are who we study. And if we end up by treating economics as about things and not about minds, we end up by losing what it is that we study. That's the position I'm going to have. Why did we end up by going in this direction? Well, you have to remember the contradictions of the 20th century, where you have a combination of tremendous technological improvements, but also tremendous tragedies of inhumanity towards man by other men. And so there's this quest for exact thinking in these demented times. This leads to a certain form of social science, which becomes dominant. The argument that I'm making is that that form of social science can't actually deliver on the goods that it promises. So what happens is various different shenanigans result, which includes replication problems, capture problems, things like that, that we have to guard against. So we have to build institutions in science to protect it against those, to have contestation, and that there is, in a way to think about economic science. There's a play here on this is an American terminology of, yes, Virginia, there is, this, but this is, it's because I think there needs to be this turn towards the Virginia School of Political Economy, which is grounded in the work of James Buchanan, and that there are a proliferation of perspectives today that we can draw on to help us reconstruct economics along a path that places it more in its moral sciences perspective rather than its engineering sciences. So let me just sort of try to walk through the argument here. So the first thing is to just, this is a quote from Ronald Coase, which, gets at this issue of the idea of what's happened is that there was a loss of the individual that we were studying. And Coase is rather quite, challenging on that. I can share all these PowerPoints with you after I'm done here. And so that way, if there's anyone who wants to have them or the working paper, that way you can circulate it among your colleagues or whoever's listening. So I don't have to read out here. But I think that there's a caricature of economics that is tied up with the core projects, which tied up with a lot of this rethinking of what's going on with economics, is captured in a recent New Yorker article in which Jonathan Gruber is trying to claim that economics is on a wrong turn, and he wants to sort of fix it. But I disagree. I agree with his diagnosis that economics is on a wrong turn. I disagree with what he thinks the culprit is. Again, if you teach basic economics, the idea that somehow basic economics teaches you that markets are always right is very dubious claim, because within 5 weeks of teaching the class of economics, you're already talking about monopoly, asymmetric information, externalities, macro instability, inequality, all of these imperfect market structures. So you're teaching all about market failure for the vast majority of a class, either in microeconomics for sure, and then in macroeconomics, it begins pretty much with the premise that the macroeconomy is out of balance and therefore in need of the various tools of fiscal policy and monetary policy to constrain things. So the idea that Jonathan Gruber is actually capturing what's wrong with economics, or what the core project does in many of these examples, is just simply they're missing the right path, or in my opinion. Instead, what we should do and this is let me just step back and give an illustration for a second from Axel Leyenhofer, the great UCLA economist, the author of on Keynes and Keynesian economics, but also a great book called Information Coordination. When I was just out of graduate school, I graduated in 1988. And then I was, it was mentioned in the introduction that I went to George Mason, and then I teach now at George Mason. But there was a 10-year period where I wasn't at George Mason. I was elsewhere. So from 88 to 98, I was at other universities, mainly New York University. And I went to this talk by Axel Leyenhofer, which was in Canada, and he was trying to explain the fate of economics. And what he argued, and I think this is will kind of make sense to people here, is that we in 1950 roughly, we had a fateful choice. We could go in one direction or we could go in another direction. And the economics profession worldwide decided to go in the Samuelsonian direction. So we adopted, so Samuelson dominated economics, both at the principles of economics level and at the graduate level. So foundations of economics and principles of economics at both levels there. It was, hitting students in that and teaching them how to do economics. And what Leyenhofer argues is that this path, the Samuelsonian path, had all the investment in it, all the intellectual resources, all the financial resources, everything pushed in that direction. And so that path goes very, very far out on a research program path. And then it hits a dead end, according to Leyenhofer. Now, we can have different judgments about this, right? But it hits a dead end, okay? The other path, which you could associate with someone like Boulding or Mises or Buchanan or, other thinkers, that were emerging at the time. Boulding, by the way, is a very interesting choice because he's the second John Bates Clark Medal winner to Samuelson. Samuelson was the first winner, Boulding's the second. But the Boulding path only has a few intellectual resources, a few, financial resources. And so that line of research doesn't develop as much. That line only goes to here. So if you judge that this line is a dead end, why can't we just imagine a dotted line of scientific research and push us all the way out here and then jump from that point to that point? And Leyenhofer said that's not possible. That's not possible. So the problem is that we have to go back to go forward. And no one wants to go back in science to go forward, because the only way we would know whether or not this research program was in fact as productive or more productive than the other one is if we start at its roots and go forward. And this is the dilemma that we face even today, because what happens is then when economists start to introduce things like values or institutions or mores, let's say we do the Deirdre McCloskey move and we talk about rhetoric and the bourgeois virtues, what they try to do is incorporate it into the Samuelsonian research program because no one wants to go back to the roots and pursue it in a different way. So what my paper is trying to make an argument about why you should go back to the roots and do that. And so that's that's the burden that I face. That's why I told that little story. But so there was resistance from within the mainstream of economics. The one of them is Boulding, as you can see here. This is his review of Samuelson right from the beginning, and he's arguing that in fact that the flawless precision of the mathematical economics, the economics that drains economic subject of its humanness, is actually going to be not very productive, whereas the literary borderland between economics and sociology may in fact be where all the action is at. On the other hand, Amartya Sen, 20 years after that, 30 years after that, he's starting to make an argument that he doesn't make the full-on argument that Boulding makes, but what he does make is an argument that we have a scientific production possibility frontier, and economics has been living in a corner solution of engineering. So if we imagine economics as engineering or economics and ethics, that there's one line is ethics, the other line is engineering. And if we're on a production possibility frontier, if we're in a corner solution of engineering, what Sen is trying to get us to do is move along the production possibility frontier to consider more issues about ethics, All right. And in many ways, that's kind of also what the core project is trying to do with economics. For those of you who are not familiar with the core project, that was a project that was started after the financial crisis for economists to have online resources available to them to have a broader notion of economics rather than the narrow notion of economics. All right. So there also is resistance from the slightly out of sync. And in this regard, I draw in the work of Hayek and of Buchanan, both of whom in their Nobel Prize addresses address the issue of the problem of economics as a problem of scientism, of the problem of the engineering mentality. Hayek, in fact, goes as far as to say in his banquet address that if he was to be asked whether or not a Nobel Prize should be given to economists, he would have, in fact, recommended against it because no economist should have that kind of power. He then proceeds to argue that economics has made economists, the economics profession, have made a mess of things. This is during the stagflation of the 1970s. The reason why they made a mess of things is because of scientism, which is a false philosophy of our practice. The fact that we practice this false view of our science, but yet continue to practice that way, means that we are on the verge of charlatanism. If we perpetuate the charlatanism, we can end up by destroying our society that we live in. That's how I explain. Buchanan begins in his Nobel Prize address with a very simple proposition. Economists must cease pro-offering advice as if to a benevolent despot. And he's challenging, again, the sort of engineering mentality and arguing, again, for a more broader notion of a philosophical economics. Now, just again, to remember the context of the 20th century, which is key to why it is that we would move in the engineering way, is that they were facing down totalitarian threats from left to right, tearing societies apart. A great book to read about the mental transformation that took place between 1900 and the 1930s is Stefan Zweig's book on the world of yesterday. And so how they grappled with that issue. So you have the totalitarian ideological threat rising on both the left and the right. You have World War I, you have the Great Depression, you have World War II. This is all the historical background of which we get to this pivotal moment of where, as I said, Leyenhoff had said, we made this fateful choice to go in one direction or another direction. And in fact, sort of lost the sort of pluralism in economics as we had earlier. But I want to point out that it's not so much that it's just in 1950 or after in the Cold War that we made this. This is a quote from A.C. Pigou from the early first decade of the 20th century. And one of the things that you can see here is that he believes that economics must bear fruit. The economist must adopt the position basically of the physician that's there to heal the world, not the philosopher that's there to try to understand the world. As he says in this passage, if you're looking for the philosopher's view of knowledge, you wouldn't look for it in the market, right? You would look for it in other areas of life, religious enthusiasm or martyrdom and these kind of questions, not in the ordinary business of life. And I think this is kind of fascinating way to think about things and contrast that with, say, Adam Smith and the way in which Adam Smith saw the wonderful mystery that was associated in producing even a common woolen coat, right? So, or the mystery that Adam Smith puts forth in trying to deal with the idea that scarce in our lifetime do we have the opportunity to make a few close personal friends, but we rely on the cooperation of a great multitude for our daily survival. How do we actually achieve that social cooperation under the division of labor? Those philosophical questions are critical, and they're not just, bland commercial place. They're the questions that are fundamental to us as in our human experience. So there's this two paradigm approach, and that relates to the Leyenhoffid position. And one of them is social engineering and economics as social control. And the other one is that we are students of society and our goal is to try to get social understanding. And, if you look at this, look at the titles, for example, the economics of control. This is what was transforming and transforming the science that stood in contrast to the kind of position that I laid out from Boulding, from, Buchanan, from Hayek. An interesting fact here is that Hayek was the dissertation director of Abel Lerner. And so this book is actually written under Hayek's direction, as his thesis advisor. That's also, true. Baumol wrote under Lionel Robbins, but Hayek was on that, dissertation committee as well. All right, so there's been 100 years of professional consensus that economists are physicians of society, not students of society. Economists do what economists do, which is model and measure. As an example of this, look at Krugman's critique of Hirschman and high development theory. His basic argument isn't that Hirschman's ideas are wrong, but that Hirschman, because he didn't put it in a tightly specified model, meant that he was not part of the discourse. And so that means he's not doing economics in Krugman's sense. Krugman's critique of Hirschman, it's called the Fall and Rise of High Development Theory. It's available for free on MIT website or whatever from back when Krugman was a professor there, and it's still like up on their server or whatever, so you can read it. It's a very interesting window into the mentality that modern economists have about how they adjudicate ideas. And then finally, but while this confidence and this attitude is here, we've seen an increasing recognition that economics is in crisis and need of soul searching. So we have shenanigans. Those shenanigans are in replication crises. Those shenanigans are in capture issues. So people, are very worried about, let's say, the influence of investment banks on business schools and professors that are tied in finance and then connected to the, to the investment banks of the U.S. This has led to, criticisms towards that, not only from Simon Johnson, but also from Luigi Zengales, who worries about this issue of capture. We worry about it with regard to antitrust policy as well, and other areas of the capture of the intellectuals by the interest groups. The other thing is just simply the sociology of the profession and the structural impediments to diversity. So economics as a profession is more highly concentrated than other social sciences, meaning that, the people that went to MIT and Harvard have a greater share of the leadership positions than other disciplines have. So we have a very strict structure of our top 5 journals. We have a very strict structure having to do with our top 5 departments, and the difference between, in the sociology of the profession, the difference between being in those places and being somewhere else is a lot different than, say, the difference between being at the top 20 ranked school and the top 50 ranked school. There's just a difference in the sociology of the profession, and that has come out in criticisms of the profession by, let's say, critics. Like, a few years ago there was the paper that circulated on the arrogance of economics, and the arrogance of the economists, and so dealing with that. Now, I should make it clear is that I'm a defender of economics, but not the economics the way it's currently practiced. I want to be a defender of the way of economics, what I call in my writings, mainline economics. The economics that derives from Adam Smith, continues in the French tradition with John Baptiste Say, is carried forward with Mill and the radical, English, philosophers, utilitarians, develops early neoclassical economics, develops in the 20th century with people like Frank Knight to Jim Buchanan, and people that are following in that line. that's the kind of economics I'm trying to get us to think about as a solution to these difficulties. And so I'm going to try to, so where do I see that we can go forward? So let me step back. What is that Buchanan position? So the Buchanan position is that what we study as economists is exchange and the institutions within which exchange takes place. Those institutions are made up of the formal and informal rules of the social game and their enforcement. That means that economics always has to be embedded within an understanding of the polity, the legality, and the society. And when you split the society up, it can be the religious institutions in society or other social mores. It can, when we talk about legality, we can talk about the formal rules, but then also the formal enforcement mechanisms that are in place. But as we all know in society, there also are informal mechanisms that discipline our behavior. For example, there's norms and that are communicated to us oftentimes through concepts of shame or concepts of, people engaged in disapprobation, right? So there's not a law, but there's social disapprobation of things. And so what we're trying to do in our modern economics is to recognize that our subject matter is the exchange relations that individuals form within various different environments. Those environments are shaped by the polity, by the legality, and the society within which they operate. And so we combine the logic of choice, right, with the situational logic that's defined by this embedded environment that we find ourselves in. And that's how we're going to understand the interactions of individuals. And so the key issue in all of this is towards an economics of natural equals, which is what I believe is our outcome. And again, as Adam, to invoke Adam Smith, remember he says that the difference between the street porter and the philosopher is in the mind of the philosopher, not in the inherent nature of these individuals. We are one another's dignified equals. And what we mean by analytical egalitarianism is just starting with the idea that people are people. And we're not trying to, theorize about the content of the individual characteristics, but instead treating people as given. And we're trying to explain, right, the unexplained variation in a pattern of outcome by variation in the institutional environments within which these individuals are pursuing their purposes and plans. So the way I envision the project of political economy is an animating agent enters into an institutional filter. That institutional filter has various different governing dynamics that's going to push the behavior in one equilibrating pattern or another equilibrating pattern. And so what we do as social scientists is circle around that institutional its filter, and that's where we're going to look at the play of the governing dynamics that are associated with that. And in order to get at that, we can't treat institutions as given. We have to treat institutions as the object of our study, utilizing the tools of basic economic reasoning to analyze the institutions that we are studying and how the variation of that institution can impact the patterns of exchange, production, and distribution. So towards an economics of natural equals, what I try to argue in the paper is we come down to kind of a four-pronged literature that we can draw on right now. So the first one is a return to Adam Smith and a recognition not only of his analytical acuteness, but also the generosity of spirit that is involved in Smith's examinations in the theory of moral sentiments. And so we have to see the two books not in juxtaposition to each other, but instead squish them together to see them. I think in many ways that's the McCloskey project that she is trying to pursue in the Bourgeois series. And afterwards, what she calls humanomics is this effort to not see those books in juxtaposition to each other, but instead as vitally connected to each other. The second view is the criticism of scientism, which gets us away from treating man as a machine and society as a machine as well, and instead forces us to think about these are human processes that we're trying to understand that are not in our direct control. They are complex phenomena. And as a result, we must stand against the scientism and the economics as the economics of control. And that means that we have to think through this criticism of the utilitarian social welfare function economics, the idea that we train economists to be engineers to maximize that social welfare function, and the elitist presumptions that when push comes to shove, the preferences that matter for the social welfare function are those of the elite. And instead, what we have to do is tear that down, this idea of the rule by experts, and instead sort of strive for a more self-governing democratic society and a social science that's associated with that, which means that being students of society rather than saviors of society, not doctors, but instead philosophers. And that's what our position is. And then this is Gillian Tett, who just came out with a wonderful book called Anthrovision. And then Diane Coyle, who's a great writer in economics. She has a new book out called Cogs and Machines. And what I don't endorse everything in the book, but what Gillian Tett is trying to get us to think about is that what our task as social scientists is to do is first to make the strange seem familiar, right? So that is, we look out the window of the world and we see various strange practices going on. And what we need to do is be able to reconstruct those practices to explain their purposes and function that they serve in the society that they're operating in. The second thing is to make the familiar strange, which is like Adam Smith and the woolen coat. We just take it for granted that we can get a woolen coat. What Smith does is he complicates that by explaining a miracle of the complex division of labor that's associated with producing even such a thing as a common woolen coat. Or later on, what Leonard Read and then Milton Friedman did was a number 2 pencil. And they hold up a pencil and they say, none of you could make this. And then they elaborate what goes into making a pencil. And so that's our other thing. And then our third task is to listen to the social sciences. As Tett likes to say, a fish doesn't recognize the water that it swims in. So if a fish isn't recognizing the water that it swims in, what we need to do is sort of take those things that are taken for granted and make them be the objects which we study. And what she argues is this requires us to have lateral vision. When we do these things, it causes us lateral vision. Whereas if instead we're myopically focused on our model, she argues it's like trying to walk through a dark woods, following with a compass, and all we do is look down at the compass, and what will happen to us is we bump into a tree, rather than the idea of making our way through the forest. So we need to have that lateral vision. That lateral vision and improvement of that is what Diane Coyle is talking about in her turn of a return to a political economy. So I think there's a leveraging of these, ideas that are out there that are, opportunities for us to sort of advance this kind of vision of economics as a broader part of political economy and social philosophy. And the final thing is an article that just came out in April of this year by Brian Arthur, who's one of the principal theorist for most of his career at the Santa Fe Institute. He's a complexity theorist. And what he argues in there is that economics for too long proceeded as if economics was about a noun, which is about a state of affairs, rather than that economics is about activity, economics for verbs. And what we need to do is we need to have an economics of activity, not an economics of a state of affairs. And the implications of that are extreme. So again, back to exchange and the institutions within which exchange takes place. Let's think just simply of a market, right? Are prices treated as exogenous or are prices endogenous to the model? They're an outcome of the exchange process itself. And so what we're studying in that regard is price formation, not price determination in a model of simultaneous equations. And so when we start thinking about economics is about bargaining, economics is about higgling and bargaining in the market, that's different than economics in the end state in which we have a clearing of a supply and demand functions, right? Simultaneous equation system takes our minds away from the process which brings it about. And so that's in a very simple notion of just the study of the market. It's instead focusing this issue on processes versus end states. And that's not just with regard to the market, it's also regard to the institutions within which the market operates, that there's endogenous change in the institutions, they evolve, they adapt, they adjust. It's all about the adapting and adjusting behavior that individuals engage in. All right, so, okay, so this is, one of my, hold on, let me see. I lost my, there we go. So this is, my professor, Jim Buchanan, used to like to quote Frank Knight all the time, which is to say a situation is hopeless is to say it's ideal. The dominance in economics, of course, is very much in the opposition of the position in which I hold. And so the issue here is that are we in a situation where we just simply can't change it? And Buchanan's ploy to us was that to say a situation is hopeless is to say it's ideal. The corollary is obviously it's not ideal, so therefore it must not be hopeless. We can, in fact, change the world for better, including the world in which we do economics. And so we are part of the equilibrium. We're trying to, make these arguments, put them out, and persuade people about the power of, in the simplest sense, following Sen and moving a little bit more towards ethics rather than in the engineering solution, or in the case of Hayek, a more radical departure from that whole notion of the way in which we do modern economics. And so along that lines, there's going to be various different arguments that people will make. And I happen to be making one that's more in line with, the sort of Hayek and Buchanan position, which is a challenge to the current practice of economics. So anyway, thank you very much for the opportunity. I'd love to field any questions that people have.
Okay, so thank you very much, dear professor, and we're looking for your questions if we have. Or some reactions.
Or reactions or criticisms. I'm all for that.
I think no questions.
Yeah.
So also there are some comments in YouTube. Thank you. There are some good comments in YouTube. So
I can't see them, so you'll have to read them to me. But Ali Khan has his hand up.
Yes, Ali Khan, I think, by the way, welcome again. I think you have a question.
Thank you. Although when you say welcome again, it's like welcome yet again, or you have nothing better to do. No, but it's delighted. I'm just simply, I missed 10 minutes because I got all confused. I missed 10 minutes of Peter's talk. As he knows very well, I am a great admirer of his, much less his teacher, with whom I was privileged to have a very deep and meaningful friendship. And you see, I have close friends, not only in George Mason, but I have been teaching for the last 20 years in the New School for Social Research, which is now called the New School University. This is my double life because I get my salary from Johns Hopkins University. And I teach Debrow's theory of value. This is a 100-page volume. It's an abstract volume. It is called Theory of Value. And I'm delighted that Peter had brought in Pigou and all the others, brought in Leon Hofwood. And so I'm delighted. But this book, I teach in my own university as a text, as a scientific text, as a sacred scientific text. and I teach it at the new school as a farce. And George Mason never invited me to teach it. I was invited to give lectures on Hayek, which Jim Buchanan graced by his presence and so on, but I never taught. But this book has always been an undercurrent. And the question is, and Peter says the Samuelsonian Foundation, but there was also a fissure between Berkeley and MIT. And this fissure involved marginalism, calculus, versus convex analysis, non-marginalism, or if you like, smoothness versus non-smoothness, piecemeal engineering versus wiping the slate clean.
Yeah.
And when Peter talks of ideal being the hopeless, this is all where those variables are saying. But I don't want to, I have a tendency to enjoy listening to my own voice, so I better shut up. So the point I want to put is, this is the puzzle. How did, and almost he would take pride and flaunt the fact that he was apolitical. How did it capture the imagination of 20 years of the economics profession? Its date is 1969. And there was another book, 1968. It was called, it was by Dorfman, Samuelson, and Solo, which started as a Rand memorandum. And it was called Programming and Economic Analysis, or Economic Analysis and Linear Programming. I don't remember the title. It was pushed to the side. De Bro's theory of value became the sacred text. And why do we need to go there? I mean, Peter talked of going to the roots, but this is the part of the roots. How come? Yeah. And I think the answers may well lie in this puzzle. Now, De Bro has passed it. And now it may well be that after I retire, there'll be nobody teaching Walrasian theory, although Walrasian theory is making a comeback in finance, believe it or not, or in pure operations research. But within economics, it's not the main paradigm. A lot of very top departments don't teach don't teach the theory of value, don't teach De Bro. And if you look at the June issue of Journal of Economic Literature, I have a review of Dupe Weintraub, which Peter has, with gratitude I say so, has read and so on. This puzzle has to be solved. How did this abstract 100-page text change the way economics is done and written? And I just want to put it on the table. Thank you.
Yeah, Ali, if I can just respond. I mean, I think that you know, my history is a bit ham-fisted for the purpose that I have. Your history is the correct history. It's much more complicated. The issues having to do with the technical aspects of, like, say, you know, smooth and continuous and twice differentiable versus, you know, discrete units and all of that in economics. I mean, you know, and I think also the transformation of economics from the sort of Walrasian system to, you know, a kind of so Marshallian to Walrasian to, you know, game theory to then, you know, Mascalel, Winston, and Green, which is a different kind of beast altogether. And that's dominated economics in the more recent period. And so a lot of this stuff is very fascinating that you start to dig up in your review of Weintraub and Dupuy. So yeah. So anyway, that's I think that your question is obviously fundamental to being able to really understand the history of modern economics. And I'm just taking a big slice of it in a broader way and for wrong or right. There's another question here that's about MPS. Let me read it and see. Can we say that ordoliberal thought was dominant in the MPS community? positive view of the state, income distribution, so it's like Boettke, Rupkin. Okay, so this is a great question about what MPS was about. I think that if you go back and look at the founding documents of MPS, Mont Pelerin Society, so there's a literature about Mont Pelerin that tries to see it as basically part of a neoliberal cabal that rose up to challenge sort of the rise of the Keynesian dominance or whatever after World War II. If you read the original document that Robbins wrote, not Hayek, Robbins wrote the original statement and aims of the society. And what Hayek's original proposal is that they wanted to have a society of accomplished academics that would mimic the British Academy, right? This is what they wanted to create, was an international academy that was modeled on the British Academy, in which they would have open debate. And so Boettke plays an extremely important role in the first meeting, because Hayek is trying to show that in the post-World War II era, we can have German language scholars be on the same footing with the people that they fought a war with, okay? And give them space. So, and again, Boettke was someone who was of tremendous integrity and did not, kowtow to the regime in Germany during that time and stuff. And so he's the perfect kind of person to be part of that conversation. Obviously, Wilhelm Rupke is part of that, but so was Michael Polanyi, various different thinkers, Karl Popper, all these different people are part of that intellectual community. And so during that period of time, there was a conversation that was going on about the nature of the institutional framework that was necessary to maintain a liberal society. All right. And so that is in the form of the polity, the legality, and the social mores. And so some of the arguments in that are conservatives, some are more, true liberals or whatever. Other people are, addressing questions having to do with, what is the nature of law? What is the nature of a constitutional, democracy and these kind of, and so, Buchanan comes out of that worldview and everything like that. So the ordo-liberal position, which is being talked about here, Boettke and they were very, very worried about power in the economy. And that included not only power by the state, but power by corporations. And so they were very worried about having the effective legal framework for the operation of a competitive economy. And in particular, they were worried about monopoly power. And so people like Mises thought that they overstated the concerns with monopoly power. And so he challenged their positions on it. Many people were making arguments about the necessity of having redistribution in order to make sure that people will sustain the system. And so there was debates about that. But the bottom line is that if you go back and you look, there was no one position that was MPS. It was a debate society. And it was a debate society in which all these different people were hammering it out. And that was the sort of idea. So yes, ordo-liberalism was very much a part of it, but it didn't dominate. Just like libertarian radicalism didn't dominate. They were all just part of the positions that people held. And you see this also in money. And then I'll get off of this topic, which is you had people that were, traditional hard money advocates. You had people who were, in fact, monetarists, and they would debate with one another about how they thought monetary policy was being operated in this period of time and with a Keynesian hegemony. And they were all arguing with each other over that. Okay. There's a follow-up question about Hayek. So in my book on Hayek, which if anyone's interested, they should email me. I'll send you a PDF of it. in the book on Hayek, I divide his career, the arc of his career, into 4 distinct moments. Economics as a coordination problem, all right, and then the issue having to do with the abuse of reason project, then the restatement of liberalism, and then the last philosophical anthropology. That is his work on the evolutionary perspective of man coming from pre-hominid to modern society. And so during the economics as a coordination period, Hayek is studying the price system and money and capital, and that's his theory of the business cycle, but it's also his theory about the market. During the abuse of reason project, what he's doing is asking, where are the methodological errors that have blinded fellow economists to the concerns that I raise in the economics as a coordination phase of his career. And then in his restatement of liberalism, which is almost simultaneous with the abuse of reason project, he starts to examine, well, what are the frameworks that make possible the coordination of economic activities through time, right? So what is the role of private property? What is the role of the rule of law, right? These kind of issues. And so that gets him to that period of where he's restating the liberal order. And then his final argument is, why is it that man is so resistant to the liberal order when the liberal order has delivered us out of the Malthusian trap? And that's where he starts to puzzle about our evolutionary past being in small bands. And so the ultimate challenge for Hayek in the end is that our moral intuitions are at odds with the moral demands of the great society. Our moral intuitions are for small group interactions, personal exchange, but the great society requires us to interact with people of great social distance and of heterogeneous but large groups. And as a result, what we need to do is engage in impersonal exchange. And our moral theory hasn't yet caught up with that project. And so that's the way in which I would see the arc of Hayek's career. And as for Dick Wagner, and in particular his most recent book on macroeconomics as systems thinking, I mean, it would take us a little too far afield for me to go into that right now, but I highly recommend, people to read that. And the way to think about what Wagner's doing in there, and going back to the conversation that Ali and I were having, Wagner is trying to argue that economics relied too much on demonstrative reasoning, which is the idea of the meta, basically the exemplar is a geometric proof, basically QED, like that. Whereas what he argues is that what we do in the social sciences is more plausible reasoning, right? So it's not that we don't have logic, but we have indeterminacy. And in many ways, that's kind of what I was hinting at when I said that you treat the animating agent and then you throw them into an institutional filter, and that filter has its logic and it's going to steer us in one direction or another. So what we don't have, going back to Ali's point about the technicalities, is we don't have closed-end choice with single exit models. We have open-ended choice with a multiplicity of exits. And thinking through that position forces us to think differently about the nature of our task as scientists. And that's where the complexity and all that other stuff comes in. So, yeah. Great questions. Thank you. Yeah. Others at all?
So,
oh,
question.
I have another question here. Do you see that? Should I just answer it if it's there or no? I mean, it's a great question.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So obviously, look, these are, I also like Timur Kuran a lot, and I would recommend Timur Kuran's work to anyone here. But obviously, Acemoglu and Roderick are fantastic economists. Daron is probably at the moment he and Andre Schleifer maybe are probably the most important economists of my generation of economists. And so, but here's the problem that I have. I don't know how Ollie thinks about this. So this will be interesting. So in Why Nations Fail, and also in the Narrow Corridor, the project is one in which it's interesting setup, right? So in the Narrow Corridor, you have society and the state. And what's going on is that those are countervailing powers to one another, society and the state. And so you kind of have this countervailing issue going on. If we don't have a state that's functioning, we get an absence of Leviathan, and that keeps us out of the corridor. And if we have a super state and very small society, we end up by having an unshackled Leviathan, and that keeps us out of the corridor. So it's only when we are inside of the corridor that we can get where the state and society are both working against each other and with each other, that you can end up getting the shackled Leviathan of the kind of liberal order that leads to economic growth. Or another way to think about it is you escape the violence trap. You escape the violence trap and you're able to achieve shackled Leviathan. Okay? But the way that they tell the story, it's unclear that they give a process by which you can go from Myanmar to Great Britain, right? Because so much of their story depends on the initial conditions, all right? On the initial conditions. So Myanmar is Myanmar because it's Myanmar. And, Great Britain is Great Britain because it was Great Britain. And, so, when you look at that, I'm reminded, and maybe I'm overstating it, but I'm reminded of a wonderful video with the scientist Richard Feynman, in which he's describing the difference between explaining things and defining things. So he talks about when he was a little kid, he goes on a trip, and all of the kids are learning about the birds. And what they need to do is they're trying to learn to match the name of a bird with a particular bird so they can identify a bird. And his father had already taught him that that's just about naming birds. What you need to know is why a particular bird, what its functioning roles are, why it's feathered the way it is, the ways in which its dynamics work and everything like that. So there's a difference between explaining and describing. And science is about explaining the governing dynamics. And so it's in this view, I think, that we need to sort of push forward a process examination of that corridor, and rather than the idea of just characterizations of where you lie in the corridor. And so to me, you need, so I think that he's, in many ways, he's probably the most important economist as measured by citations and, impact and all these things like that. But I still think it needs improvement to be able to move to the next level of analysis. But I was part of the group that vetted the book at a conference at Northwestern. And so I had a tremendous opportunity to interact with both Robinson and Asimoglu. I teach their work. Their work's great stuff. So I think very highly of it. Danny Roderick wrote one of my favorite papers in economics called Promises, Promises. It's a long time ago, about 20, 30 years ago. It was about in policy reform, why governments need to overshoot. And that was very influential on the way that I approached stuff when my beginning of my career was all focused on post-Soviet, Soviet history and then post-Soviet history. I did my dissertation on the Russian Revolution in the first 10 years. Then I did another book called Why Perestroika Failed. And then I did, another book on the 10 years after the transition or whatever. And so I was focused a lot on those issues, and Roderick's paper was a very influential paper on me on this problem of the policy game that is played within the transition process. So, and I like his paper on ideas versus interests. And so I think Danny Roderick has a lot of really powerful things. Timur Karan is a colleague of mine. He and I edit a series with Cambridge University Press. He's, in my opinion, humble opinion, he's one of the most insightful social thinkers, and his notion of preference falsification and preference reversal. And so I study him very closely as well as work with him. And I learn from him every time I read from him. So I think these are just fantastic economists, and I hope that they are well read in your economic community in Turkey and respected for the developments that they're making. So.
So,
do you want me to answer this last question on Eleanor Ostrom?
Yes, sure. If you, but of course, if you have time for this.
Yeah, I'll answer this last one, and that will be it. Okay. So first off, it's a great question. A lot of people ask this question. There's sort of two ways to kind of answer that question. I wrote a book on Lynn and Vincent's research program. It came out before she won the Nobel Prize. It's called Challenging the Institutional Analysis of Development. It came out the same year, in fact, that she won the prize. But it was written before, she won the prize. In fact, I won a bet because I was at a conference in New Mexico. And as economists like to do, they start going around with the odds of who will win the Nobel Prize. And I said, don't sleep on Lynn Ostrom. She deserves to win a Nobel Prize. And I will tell you that the vast majority of people that were in that conference looked at me and said, who the hell is Lynn Ostrom? And I said, precisely, this is why she's going to surprise you all. But I don't go many places without a copy of this book near me. You can see I have all my little markings in it and everything like this. And I want to just read to you the very end of the book. So she gets all the way done, after doing all this study of common pool resources, right? And then she comes to the very end. And a lot of times when you want to understand what an author is up to, you have to read the very end of their book and the very beginning of their book. The beginning of the book is when they have a first chance to tell you what they're up to. The very end is when they have the last chance to tell you what they're up to. So what does she argue here, right? The title is called A Challenge to Scholarship in the Social Sciences. Not, I'm going to tell you one more time with feeling about common pool resources. Common pool resources are her exemplar of something. But what she's trying to do is social science and tell you about it. But what is it that she wants to tell you about, right? This is on 214 to 215 of Governing the Commons. And what she says is that economists and social scientists are led into a trap. These are her words, okay? The intellectual trap in relying entirely on models to provide the foundation for policy analysis is that scholars then presume that they have omniscient observers omniscient observers are able to comprehend the essentials of how complex dynamic systems work by creating stylized descriptions of some aspect of these systems. With this false confidence of presumed omniscience, scholars feel perfectly comfortable in addressing proposals to government that are conceived in their models as omnicompetent powers able to rectify imperfections that exist in all fields settings. She later goes on leveraging some work from Robert Sugden, which challenges what is she calling the synoptic point of view, which is seen like a state. What she wants to do is have a social science which sees like citizens. Okay, so the way to think about this is that what Eleanor is trying to do is place the priority on the clever and creative actors in the model, not the clever and creativity of the theorists of the world, but in the people that are populating the world. And so she's doing economics from the inside out rather than from the outside in. Okay. Her very last paragraph, when she's summarizing where she's all coming from, what's it all about? Who does she say that she's doing? She's building on the work of Hume and Smith and Madison and Tocqueville. And then she has, and many others. And then in the footnotes, in the footnotes, then you start talking about the Jim Buchanans and her husband, Vincent Ostrom, and people like that. So Eleanor wanted to do economics, and as did Vincent, that was appropriate for a self-governing democratic society. And it's in that self-governing democratic society aspect that I see the overlap between her and the kind of positions of classical liberalism that you're asking me to think about. And that also comes out, again, I think it's very important to read Lynn and Vincent together as a joint research program that they are pursuing together as their life career, what she calls their polycentric journey. And so if you read Vincent's book, The Meaning of Democracy and the Vulnerabilities of Democracies, which is his treatise in some sense, this idea comes out, more and more. Now, I'll finish up by just an action. First of all, I want to recommend the movie, which is on, there's a movie about the Ostroms that PBS did, which tells about their whole research program and their life together. And I really recommend, looking that up. It's a fantastic documentary done by Barbara Allen, who was one of their students. But it's also the case that Lynn and Vincent, existed in a hostile academic world. And so they were very strategic in the way that they interacted with that hostile academic world, and communicated their sort of ideas in that world. So you have to dig a little bit to find their associations and their intellectual heritage and stuff. And a lot of people don't see that, and they don't pay attention to that because they lose sight of that. So if you go back and look at the early students, they were much more clued in to this world than later students, where they're just picking up the research program and going from there. So anyway, look at my book with Paul Alagica on the Ostroms, or our more recent book, which was published in 2019 with Oxford, on public administration. It's a restatement and redefining book of Vincent's intellectual crisis of public administration. And it's called Public Governance in a Classical Liberal Tradition. So anyway, I hope that that's an answer to you in that question. But it's a great question to ask, and what we're all up to. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think it's time to end this.
Yeah. But I greatly appreciate the opportunity and the questions, and I'm really fortunate. And if anyone wants to ask me further questions, my email address is just pboettke@gmu.edu, and people can send me whatever questions, criticisms, suggestions that they might have. I would greatly appreciate it. And in the meantime, thank you very much. And I hope everyone has a great new year, and that your seminar series continues to be a beacon to people to see about economic pluralism. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Very much also for your this valuable presentation, and also dear Professor Ali Khan, dear Professor Dr. Ercan Eren, thank you for your questions and participation.
Hocam bir de Ersan Bocutluoğlu buradaydı ama gitti.
No, Ersan Bocutluoğlu is also here, yeah, I think. No?
Yes.
So thank you very much for all these participations.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for organizing this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.